morning or afternoon. My name is Florence Gaignerot-Driessen, and it is a real pleasure to present today with my colleagues the first results of recent excavations conducted in the early Iron Age tumular necropolis at Anavlochos in Crete. Survey and excavations at Anavlochos have been carried out by the French School at Athens since 2015 under my responsibility by permission of the Hellenic Ministry of Culture and Sports. I'm presenting today with Alexia Latard, who studied the human remains that we brought to light in the necropolis in 2017 and 2018, Catherine Judson, who is currently studying the associated pottery, and Karine Sanson-Salver, who analyzed the charcoal collected from the pyres identified in the necropolis. We all express our warmest thanks to the organizers of the conference for giving us the opportunity to take part and join session 14. Anavlochos is a 5-kilometer-long ridge of mountains overlooking the village of Vrachasi and the Mirabello Valley in Eastern Crete. The place was first investigated by French archaeologist Pierre Demargne on behalf of the French court at Athens for 5 days in 1929. Among various remains, Demargne notably reported several megalithic terrace walls of the early Iron Age in the settlement that occupies the higher part of the central valley. He also noticed series of small ruined tombs in the contemporary necropolis that extends at the foot of the settlement. Rescue excavations were more recently carried out by the effort of Antiquities of Lacippi at several places of Anavlochos, both in the settlement and in the necropolis area. The French court at Athens resumed work at Anavlochos in 2015. First, in 2015 and 2016, a survey was conducted on the wall massif that allowed us to localize and reconsider the remains mentioned by Demargne, but also to clarify the extent, nature, and chronology of occupation of the ridge. Then, based on the result from this survey, we started excavating at Anavlochos in 2017 in the early Iron Age settlement and necropolis, and at 3 core places identified during the survey. A bench building that is located on the slope of Kakoupli, midway between the settlement and the necropolis, and that was in use roughly between 1050 and 450 BC. 2 votive deposits on the summit of the ridge, which yielded hundreds of terracotta plaques and figurines ranging in date from 1200 BC to 450 BC. But what we would like, of course, to present today more specifically is a preliminary synthesis of our discoveries in the early Iron Age necropolis. In 1929, Pierre Demargne excavated series of what he describes as ruined groups of small thallus tombs of circular or rectangular shape that are situated on small hills at the foot of the settlement in an area crossed by the old path leading from Sicily to Mileto and Neapoli. Before his investigation, the area had been extensively looted, and Demargne reports that all the structures he cleaned or excavated had already been visited and emptied of their content, except for one, Tomb Alpha on Hill B1. No remains of human bones were identified neither in this tomb nor in the others, and Demargne deduced that cremation was practiced, although he does not mention the presence of any charcoal or ashes. Among the finds from Tomb Alpha are a fragment of a stirred jar, a jug, and an arebelos that refer to the sub-Minoan and proto-geometric periods, that is roughly to the 11th, 10th centuries BC. In the rest of the necropolis area, Demargne collected artifacts dated to between the 10th and the 8th centuries, He mentions fragments of proto-geometric lead geometric bases, as well as fragments of geometric bronze tripod legs and a small lamella of gold that were not associated with any architectural structure, though. Our first attempt, of course, was to find the remains reported by Demargne. So in 2016, during the survey of the area, we identified quite securely a series of heaps of stones with the so-called tombs mentioned in the 1931 report by Demargne. Then we surveyed the area in search for other potential graves based on a set of criteria defined by analogy with Demargne's tombs. We first considered the topography. Demargne's groups of tombs were located on small mounds or steps on the slopes. We were also sensitive to the presence of any potential architectural remains and archaeological material typical for early Iron Age funerary areas, such as ashes or charcoal, concentration of well-preserved fragments of decorated fineware, and fragments of metallic artifacts such as weapons or jewels and ornaments. Finally, we paid attention to the vegetal cover, as we noticed that small trees or thick thorny bushes typically developed in the remains of the structures reported by Demargne. Based on this topographical, archaeological, and botanical evidence, we recorded anomalous piles of stones as potential tombs or groups of tombs. The next step was to test our hypothesis and excavate some of the piles of stones we had recorded. In certain instances, excavations were rather disappointing. They only confirmed that the heaps of stones we recorded were heaps of stones resulting from land cultivation in the early 19th century. In other instances, clear funerary structures were identified, but in such a ruined state of preservation that it was impossible to recognize their typology with certainty. But finally, in one instance that was, however, not terribly more promising at first sight, the results were much more successful. The same place after 1 week of excavations, after 2 and 3 weeks, and after 4 weeks of excavations. This stone tumulus with a diameter of 15 meters is delimited by a circular pyre-tomb. It is made of local limestone rubble, but the center was marked by a sandstone ashlar block, very possibly originating from the late Bronze Age nearby coastal sites of Sicily or Mallia. A line of stones was also observable on the surface. The fragments of 11 amphoras and at least 2 stands were recovered from the surface of the tumulus that may have been left in situ after the end of the funeral, maybe as markers or to commemorate the funerary rituals that were performed. All the material brought to light in Anavlochos was conserved by Pipisarideki and photographed by Chronis Paparnikolopoulos, and we are very grateful for their work. In the last phase of use of the tumulus, a seized grave, serving as secondary cremation burial for one individual, most probably an immature one, was attached to the peribolos. Some burned animal bones were recovered in association with the human remains, as well as 3 very fragmented but almost complete vessels, 2 pyxides, one of them presenting a clear early 7th century profile, and a lid that were heterogeneously burned. The ceramic fragments were thus probably collected with the bones from the pyre, which has not been located though. Inside the peribolos, excavations revealed 2 circular pits, 1 and 2, that had been looted and were found empty, except for some tiny splinters of burned bones and shards. in the rubbing trenches. In contrast, the apsidal pit 3 was found almost intact and yielded an impressive assemblage of artifacts, which notably includes two groups of respectively 2 and 3 spearheads. 2 of them were deliberately bent, making them unusable and thus probably illustrating a ritual killing of offerings. The pit also contained 15 complete vessels, including 2 oinokois of Cypriot style, 2 lekane, 7 cups, 1 amphora, a jug, an areobolos, and lead. The 2 lekane, oinokois, and black monochrome cups compose 2 almost identical sets, maybe echoing the 2 groups of spearheads. The third lekane was recovered in pit 3, but fragmentary. The missing fragments were recovered from the small rubbing trench that opened the northeastern side of the pit. Interestingly, pit 3 also contained 3 large fragments, respectively belonging to 2 amphoras and 1 pithos. One of the 2 amphoras fragments comes from one of the amphoras recovered from the surface of the tumulus, possibly illustrating a ritualized practice including the breakage of the funerary vessel and the deposition of one selected fragment. Interestingly, from the 7 cups from this pit, the only one that is decorated presents a potter's mark, which had been incised before cooking. All this material roughly dates to 750–650 BC. No human remains or ashes come from pit 3, which may have been either a repository of funerary objects or a cenotaph. Under the central ashlar block, we exposed a badly preserved rectangular structure, pit 4, where we found the remains of at least 3 successive cremations. However, most of the bones were removed from the pyres after the cremation. They may have been deposited in pits 1 and 2. On the 482 fragments of charcoal recovered from pit 4, 20% were heavily vitrified, making the identification of the type of wood used for the pyre impossible. 75% of the fragments belong to olive tree, while 25% belong to twigs of Pistachia, Rhamnus, and Filaria species. 4 samples of Pistachia species revealed that the wood had been cut down during dormant season, that is in fall, when pistachio trees develop small reddish and odoriferous drops. Twigs of Pistachia species may therefore have been introduced in the composition of the pyres, not only as fire raisers, but maybe also to create a visual or olfactory effect for the attendees of the cremation or for the deities. Further excavations in the tumulus revealed that the enigmatic line of stones visible on the surface of the stone tumulus was actually part of a stepped installation for the pyre built in pit 5 for the first deceased associated with the tumulus. The type of food represented by the 60 fragments of charcoal recovered from pit 5 is identifiable for 86% of them. 70% of the fragments represent olive tree, and 16% represent twigs of Mylodia rosacea species. And at this stage of research, it is not possible to say if olive tree was only used for practical reason or if this choice also reflects some ritual function. The twigs of rosacea species were probably used as fire raisers. The presence of some intact twigs indicates that the combustion was only partial, suggesting that the pyre partly collapsed, stopping the combustion on both sides at the bottom of the pit. This scenario is corroborated by the distribution of the human remains, which shows that the residues from the cremation were not mixed during the combustion or after its completion. Soon after the cremation, the pyre was sealed and the pit was filled in with a mixture of stones and dry sandy soil to the top of the stepped installation. The location of this rectangular pit, which is half built, half cut in the bedrock, remained indicated in the central ashlar by the central ashlar block until the last phase of use of the tumulus. The place was not only designed for the pyre, but also for the burial of one individual, the first deceased. It actually represents the only primary burial associated with the tumulus. The material it yielded includes an ivory plaque, ivory and bronze pins, a bronze fibula, some iron fragments, 2 clay spindle wheels, and a cup. This material is provisionally dated to 750 BC, and part of it is remarkable for its most likely intentional breakage. The cup, ivory object, and clay bead have in common to have been fragmented right through the middle. In particular, the burned half part of the cup comes from the pit itself, while the unburned second half part was stuck in the top of the wall of the pit, illustrating an obvious case of ritual breakage during the cremation. Further investigation in the south part of the tumulus did not reveal any other structures. It seems that only the north part was designed to house pits, compensating the natural slope of the bedrock, as visible on this section drawn by our site architect, Marilena Pateraki. In other words, the shape and impressive size of the tumulus, which represents an area of about 175 square meters, would only respond to a desire for ostentation. In any case, this tumulus represents a monumental platform or stage, which was potentially designed to gather a large group of people and perform funerary ritual above and around the initial and sole pyre burial. Libations, offering, breakage of offerings, selection and deposition of fragments, cremation, and removal of bones. The history of this tumulus and the way it sort of traveled through time and space can provisionally be reconstructed as follows. Somewhere in the mid-8th century BC, an eminent individual, most likely associated with the community established in the Anavlochos settlement, died. We don't know who he or she was. We don't know why he or she was important. But for some reason, the death of this individual resulted in a spectacular funeral and a monumental burial. A gigantic pyre was built and the deceased received offerings. Some of them were ritually killed before or during the funeral. A circle was drawn around the grave. A pyre-bolus was built, and a stone tumulus covered the burial. The central place was remembered by an antique, very likely Minoan, ashlar block. Some decades later, pyres were built for newly deceased, whose bones were redeposited, possibly in other pits of the tumulus or somewhere else in the necropolis. Finally, part of the bones of another individual, probably a young one, who was cremated in a pyre located outside of the tumulus, were buried in a cease grave abutting the tumulus. After about a century of use, the place was abandoned. Natural processes of erosion and sedimentation progressively obliterated this monumental funerary structure, which was, however, further damaged by looters, probably in the early 20th century. In turn, their robbing trenches were erased by natural processes and agro-pastoral activities. When Pierre Demargne investigated the place in 1929, we can assume that nothing was visible, as he did not report any remains. All that was left when we surveyed the place in 2016 was some unnatural accumulation of limestone rubble. The tumulus, the monumental marker, or sema, as Homer would call it, had entirely disappeared from the landscape. The monument was finally excavated from 2017 and entirely reappeared in 2018. The remains were immediately protected and consolidated in 2019 and 2020 by Manolis Kassotakis and his team under the supervision of the Greek authorities. And this 3D animation was produced by our topographers, Brio Guillaume and Lucille Cocher, during a conservation work that was finally completed last summer in 2020. This tumulus offers an obvious archaeological version of a phenomenon that is well attested in the Homeric epics. It is difficult not to think here of Patroclus' tumulus, whose description is detailed in Book 23 in the Iliad. More importantly, rather than their similarities, the informative value of the discrepancy between archaeological and literary sources can be highlighted here. Unlike Patroclus' one, the Anavlochos tumulus was stone and not earth-built. It contained an 8th century primary burial and several pyres, as well as a repository of objects and an abutting secondary burial, whereas Patroclus' tumulus is actually a cenotaph for one individual, a legendary hero of the Trojan War. The sacrifice of horses and Trojan captives mentioned in the Iliad may nonetheless be regarded as an epic version of some rituals observed at Anavlochos, where animal sacrifice is attested in the abutting seagrave and where iron spearheads, probably ritual kills, were offered. The tumulus at Anavlochos also offers evidence for ritual practices that are not explicitly mentioned in Homer, such as the breakage of offerings during the funeral and the selection and deposition of fragments. It is also striking that the Anavlochos necropolis offers as many early Iron Age funerary tumuli as the wall throughout itself, according to the Homeric epics, if not more. Because retrospectively, the discovery of this relatively well-preserved tumulus has thus allowed us to identify 3 other tumuli among the structures recorded on the same slope during the survey, all in a very ruined state of preservation, though. You can see the 4 of them on this aerial video, starting from the well-preserved one at the foot on the slope. In total, at least 8 tumuli existed in the wall necropolis, and probably more, including the so-called ruin groups of tombs mentioned by Demargne, where part of the Beribolos is actually still preserved. The clearly identified tumuli from Anavlochos range from 10 to 20 meters in diameter and show variations in internal construction and organization, maybe as part of a process of self-definition and identification from the social groups who used them. But interestingly, in the Anavlochos necropolis, other types of funerary structures are coexisting with these tumuli. Some small, isolated or grouped tholos tombs have also been recorded. Unfortunately, all of them have been looted, and they are generally in a very poor state of preservation. Just below the best preserved tumulus, a contemporary but poorly preserved rectangular structure was also brought to light. It yielded secondary deposition of cremations, as well as a number of objects. We notably collected there numerous pieces of bronze that could compose a mitre comparable to the ones recovered from the nearby urban center of Droas. Among the finds from this burial enclosure are also three bird figurines pierced under the abdomen, possibly to be fixed on the stand, that could depict a soaring bird in three successive phases. They may be reminiscent of figurines recovered from disturbed contexts at Ticalario on the island of Naxos, where early Iron Age circular groups of graves, possibly covered by a mound, are attested, together with other types of contemporary funerary structures. To sum up, although other isolated examples of tumuli may exist elsewhere on Crete, and in particular in Plinias, the case of Anavlochos presents so far the first clear attestation of a tumular necropolis in early Iron Age Crete. During the last two campaigns of excavations at Anavlochos, scheduled this summer and in 2022, the plan is to explore another area of the necropolis where another tumulus associated with unidentified structures was recording during the survey. By 2022, we will also complete the cleaning and consolidation of the architectural remains that we brought to light. The tumular necropolis at Anavlochos offers a unique opportunity to document mortuary practices, funerary rituals, and social organization of a Cretan community immediately preceding the emergence of the Greek city-states and their civic tribes, which are well attested by the 7th century inscribed laws recovered from the nearby city of Droas. The layout of the necropolis in tumuli or small clusters of graves seems to indicate that separate social groups were structuring the community. This is precisely what we want to clarify by digging further in the necropolis and studying the archaeological remains and movable material recovered. But for the same reason, further excavation in the settlement where separate districts have already been tentatively recognized are also planned, although the settlement and the necropolis do not necessarily reflect the same social groupings. In any case, although it sounds the most plausible, we have to admit that up to now, neither the necropolis nor the settlement have yielded any evidence demonstrating that the different social groups structuring the Anavlochos community were kin affiliated. So far, the only human remains recovered from the necropolis are bones and cannot be subjected to DNA analysis. As for the district brought to light in 2019 in the settlement, the Quartier de la Forge, which includes a large residence, a bench building, and a smithy with its dump, it does not show the replicative and agglutinative pattern of expansion typical for kin-affiliated groups. It rather seems to be organized around a specific craft activity, the intensive manufacture of iron objects. Let's hope that future discoveries at Anavlochos and studies of the remains may help us to progress in this research question. We had the chance to mention some of our collaborators during the presentation. We also would like to express our gratitude in general to the courageous and talented team of students, scholars, and technicians who are responsible for the results we presented today. Finally, we would like to thank all the universities, research institutes, and private foundations that supported the Anavlochos project through the generous grants and prizes awarded since 2015. Thank you very much for your attention.